welcome to Censored. I'm Dr. Lloyd May of Houston.
And I'm Dr. Aoife Vertnach.
And today we're having another sort of end-of-term episode, I guess. Rather than centering our attentions on a particular film, we are looking at some of the kind of interesting ephemera that the process of film censorship generates. And particularly, we are looking at this year's reports from the BBFC, which is obviously Britain's film classification body, and the Irish IFCO, its counterpart. And yeah, they're surprisingly sort of rich documents, I think, in terms of getting a sense both of how these organisations kind of work, but also of just the radically sort of different way in which they're attempting to sort of pitch themselves compared to their often sort of Sphinx-like approach in the past. What did you make of looking at these, Aoife?
Yeah, I was really taken with them as documents compared to a lot of government reports or government adjacent reports. Very readable, very transparent, as they kept using the word transparent, and compared to what we've tried to do with earlier engagements between censors and filmmakers, you know, that was all behind closed doors, and that sort of stuff is all locked away in archives, and you know, you have to go to a great deal of effort to find out what a censor might have thought in order to make a cut. And although these reports are only, you know, selections or highlights, they actually came out and said specifically why they did this or they didn't do this and why they thought this was appropriate. And that whole attempt to present themselves as something that, you know, you might understand and you might have an opinion on as a citizen or a filmgoer. I just thought it's such a shift. It's such a dramatic shift from the historic material that we've been looking at so far.
It's fascinating how so much of this is sort of framed quite explicit. I mean, you know, we're both, you know, academics and or, you know, people sort of entangled with and perhaps recovering from the academy. But the way in which all of this is sort of bound up with the kind of language of public engagement and framed in a very sort of like grant-winning kind of way, I find very interesting. You know, you have the BBFC report is particularly sort of fulsome on this, you know, gathering and presenting evidence on its ongoing salience as an institution. So this is the most recent report that's available is the 2022 one, or the activities of the BBFC in 2022, which was the 110th year of the organization's existence. And by God, they were keen to kind of remind you that, like, people like that there are, you know, classification being given and that they trust and rely on these, that the government thinks it's a good idea, you know. They said that 9 out of 10 parents or guardians or carers of people aged, you know, 4 to 12 relied on BBFC certificates when making decisions about what to show their kids, and that even 57% of, you know, 16 to 19-year-olds would consult what the kind of classification category was. So yeah, there's this real sense of like, no, we're still relevant. We swear. Netflix has us on 100% of their, you know, of their offerings in the UK. It was interesting as well, like, you know, obviously they had that kind of breakdown of like, here are statutory duties, here are non-statutory duties, like here is how we're trying to kind of make ourselves kind of relevant to that, or continue our relevance to that process. So, you know, they were talking a lot about which streaming providers and video on demand services they were working with. Also their role in mobile network kind of content regulation. So like they form part of the sort of base filtration system that's used on UK mobile. If you set it to like, you know, if you set your sort of contract to like being safe for children, they're what helps sort of determine what goes to phones. So it was an interesting sort of map of like, oh, okay, yeah, the BBFC is in, you know, plugged into a large number of things and seeking to be plugged into them.
Yeah, I was going to say what really struck me was their non-statutory function, which I wasn't entirely aware that they were actively working to create these filters on mobile phones. I had presumed they had something to do with video on demand classifications, but I wasn't it was kind of a bit of a woolly concept to me. It was just like, someone must be responsible for whatever comes up in the corner there that says, whatever age or whatever number. But I hadn't really thought about it. And I just thought it was so interesting that they are still doing that sort of informal, like, stuff that doesn't come directly from the legislation, which is how they started out. Like, they start out as an industry body negotiating with filmmakers and sort of trying to set standards by consensus. And they are still doing that in, I suppose, the material that we are all consuming the most of now, which is everything that comes through the internet.
If you think back to our Video Nasties episode, we obviously talked about that sort of, especially in the case of Ireland, surprisingly long window where there was no statutory sort of regulation framework for that becoming a sort of dominant of content consumption. And it's funny to realise, like, oh shit, yeah, there is no statutory framework for rating, like, video streaming, really, or, holistic one, at least. The online safety bill, looms on the horizon in way inform this. But, again, you could see the BBFC, like, positioning themselves as, we've been, like, really foregrounding how they've been integral to discussions that have been going on around that. I think Ofcom are also the sort of dominant body in the UK that deal with sort of digital material. There was an interesting, in terms of things online, the report features a very brief sort of reference to the porn that they've been asked to rate.
Yeah.
In continuing a fine tradition of the BBFC being weirdly specific about certain acts that they object to. Famously, the BBFC don't like headbutt and they don't like nunchucks, or didn't for a very long time. Choking in erotic contexts, anything done without consent, etc., that you would probably expect, but in line with Britain's wider, slightly sort of odd legal frameworks around consensual sadomasochistic kind of practices, stuff like that is a no-go for formally rated erotic content.
I was sort of stunned that anyone was submitting anything pornographic to them for rating, because I thought it was all online and you just went and found it on a website somewhere, and that is dealt with through their other sort of non-statutory regulations. But submitting for a formal release,
as you say, obviously the digital space has completely eaten this alive, but I do think that there is still a reasonable body of I guess, more sort of specific and curated and maybe slightly higher production values, sort of content that's coming out on disc that presumably would still then be subject to the Video Act, and thus, But yeah, it feels counterintuitive to have someone being like, do you sign off on this?
I don't think the Irish Film Censors Office mentioned anything about having to classify 100% porn without any attempt to be anything else.
Again, the beautifully ever elusive prospect of, a kind of indigenous Irish porn industry and what that would look like or entail. And my sincere apologies to anyone involved in that industry if it is extant and rich in ways that, yeah. we are not doing justice to. We are a sex work positive podcast here. Yeah, the other funny kind of marketing spiel thing from all of that that tickled me was we are looking for scalable AI solutions to this. Like, even the poor fucking BBFC are having to be like, yeah, AI will somehow answer all of our problems for this.
Yeah, would somehow detect and label correctly and tell us exactly what's in this material without us actually having to watch it. Please, we do not want to have to watch it.
They talk about it as what streaming providers want from classification schemes is a universally applicable international or transnational format that just allows it to be put out everywhere, in the same form. And so you see the BBFC sort of talking about wanting to make themselves amenable to that, or developing tools involving AI and the cloud and other slightly nebulous tech buzzwords that will somehow allow maybe, I guess, streamers to sort of anticipate what the BBFC might say or something. I know that obviously machine learning sort of stuff is plumbed into content moderation on social media. So I'm sure it's not quite as preposterous as it sounds, but equally, yeah, the only thing worse than something watched by a civil servant of some stripe is, you know, something watched by an AI and their determination about what's appropriate. Yeah. As, you know, again, as literally anyone who's, you know, tried to sort of produce even sort of moderately erotic content on the internet or, you know, on social media, to kind of, you know, will tell you that these things are hair trigger.
But how do, you know what you just said there, where the industry wants some sort of transnational, international standard that then they just tweak ever so slightly for whatever country they happen to be releasing it in. I mean, that just sounds a bit mad. Like, I don't really see why that is even something we should be going for, because it's such a flattening concept that, you know, human cultural expression is just, we just take out like 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, or whatever. And also it means that the people who produce the material are in fact the transnational, intercultural standard. And that tends to be 1 or 2 countries in the world and 1 or 2 places in those countries.
It means that obviously you're subject to the sort of, I suppose, the tyranny of the person with the most extreme position, right? Whatever one might say about the sort of limitations of free expression in, you know, kind of Anglo-American context or what have you, like, you know, I would not, the media I would like would not fare well in the face of the content moderation systems of, you know, nations with explicitly homophobic and transphobic legislation on their statute books. I don't necessarily want to watch something that would pass political muster in Putin's Russia, etc. But I think, you know, the other thing it speaks to is, and again, not to sound too sort of old Tran shakes fist at Cloud, it is, I think this is part of the way that the sort of digital content paradigm, right, and content rather than, you know, kind of art, is that it is just like, look, we want to sluice this mass-produced sort of material as freely and frictionlessly as possible into the widest possible domain, and to have to think about it as little as needs be. And yeah, so this whole, you know, having to navigate the specific cultural sensibilities of a given place or time is, I think, is not something that the digital streamer kind of paradigm really invites.
Slightly problematic, I have to say. I mean, you know, I mean, it is also, it's one of those things that you see in government all the time, is like there is this perfect, smooth, easy solution somewhere. We just have to find it. And I always feel slightly sorry for people in government who won't just accept that it's always a hard slog, that it just goes up and down, and sometimes you're winning and then sometimes you're losing, and like small gains matter, but trying to get this utopia of everything will work, you know, like the ID card will make everything perfect, or the no ID card will make everything perfect. It's like, lads, you know, government is just, it's messy.
And then you have to pay people to do it. Well, you know, that's the other sort of big thing. I mean, in terms of their sort of priorities, it's interesting, you know, the BBFC talk about how, like, child protection is at the heart of what we do, and we make all our classification decisions in line with what UK audiences tell us they want and expect. And yeah, that sort of, you know, children and families being the key stakeholders for them isn't a shock, but it's telling. I mean, partly that comes out of, you know, as they state in the report, the fact that, like, really, you know, people over the age of 18, as far as they're concerned, can kind of do what they like within, you know, reason. Well, I mean, maybe we'll talk about, you know, one of the things that I think stood out for both of us were the reclassification of films that had once had U certificates that have now become PGs for interesting reasons.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them have been changed in the last 10 years or so, but for different reasons for each film. So yeah, the U category is like for children 4 years and up, and it's supposed to be like the most harmless material, like, you know, unobjectionable. Your children can watch it. You don't have to watch it at the same time with the pause button in case it all goes wrong, and you don't have to have tissues nearby. But they have taken films that were and they've moved them up to the next grade, which is the PG, parental guidance, which, you're supposed to actually take some care as a parent and be involved in the moment, which really defeats the purpose of turning on the feckin' screen in the first place, which is that you just want to go somewhere else for an hour. Maybe have a bath.
I do feel like at least some of these decisions can be kind of explained by the logic of like, yeah, no, like your children won't be scarred by this, but they probably will be an arsic afterward. Like they might have questions or like be hard to get to sleep or something.
Yes. I mean, one of the ones that got changed, well, it didn't go from you, but it was a PG originally, Ghostbusters. And they've changed it now to a 12. It's funny because Ghostbusters, my daughter watched it when she was under 12 and was like fucking horrified, terrified. You couldn't even say the word Ghostbusters in her presence, but that she'd be like, "Oh my god!"
Well, like, was it the bits that were intended to be scary, or
yes, yeah, the scary bits.
Because admittedly, I will say this on the one level is a bit wild, but there is a sequence where Dan Aykroyd is given oral pleasure by a ghost. And, that's a bit of that movie that I think, it slips out of people's minds.
But the thing is, I have watched that film, I don't know how many times, and I genuinely don't really notice that. And it's only after reading someone mentioned it somewhere, and I was like, hang on, is that? And then I watched it again, I was like, oh my god, how did that just completely sail over my head like I wasn't in the room?
And Bill Murray is like unapologetically and profoundly lascivious in that film, and like it's almost as if it wasn't actually intended for children, and it's largely a byproduct of the real Ghostbusters cartoon that it's that classic sort of 80s thing of like basically an adult film that has real merchandise potential. So they sort of like incept you into thinking it's a kid's thing. And then that spawns a generation of like weirdly ardent fans who now treat it reverentially in a way that's produced some very strange reboot sequels. Sorry, that's my Ghostbusters soapbox. Stop making Ghostbusters movies, please. Let it rest.
There was a cartoon series I used to watch as well, like in the early 90s.
Yeah. That's the real Ghostbusters. So named so as to avoid a copyright dispute over another cartoon that was also called the Ghostbusters or something. Anyway, weirdly, the cartoon is the real Ghostbusters, while the real Ghostbusters is not the real Ghostbusters.
Okay, that's good to know. You know way too much about the Ghostbusters here now. This is...
I need listeners to understand what it's like to be inside my head.
Welcome, it's crowded.
Another interesting one was Watership Down got bumped up.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was absolutely fucking terrifying. Like, the novel was in my mother's bookcase, and I used to take it down and look at the front cover, which is that black rabbit silhouette with the white teeth. And
I do very vividly remember when one of them gets caught in a snare and is like bleeding from the mouth and stuff, and but there's a part of me that thinks that like it is the sacred duty of children's media to like scar children just a little bit.
I mean, look, the Bambi film, when his mother and all, like, that's all terribly traumatic when you watch it as a small child first. And it's kind of supposed to be. I don't think you're supposed to think, oh, it's okay that the film is made so that the animals are people. So you are supposed to engage with these characters like they're real humans. And this baby loses its mother. Of course it's terrible. I don't really think you should like delete that and just be like, oh, it actually wasn't that bad and he got over it. And it's like, no, this is deeply painful. And there's nothing wrong with children being exposed to knowing that sort of loss happens. I mean, they know it anyway, deep in their gut.
No, 100%. Another one that tickled me is Star Trek The Motion Picture, which was bumped from a U to a PG for brief mild horror and sex references, which I'm pretty sure is there's a sequence where they they try to bring people onto the sort of refurbished Enterprise using the transporter, but it goes wrong and they all get like gooped together, and then they get like they sort of half materialize on the Enterprise and then get sent back to the satellite or like the space station from which they're transporting, and you're sort of told Enterprise, what came back, didn't live long. And it's kind of like out of nowhere, slightly gruesome moment. That's good stuff.
And it's honest, because when you look at the transporter thing, there's always a part of you going, I don't know, that seems like it could go so grossly wrong.
I'll contain myself. The kind of metaphysical implications of the transporter in Star Trek, which
you're not containing yourself now, right?
Which notionally, documents you sort of atom by atom, destroys the material, like that iteration of you, transmits the data, and then reconstitutes you from scratch in the other location. Like in a kind of Ship of Theseus sense, like, are you the same person? Like every time you see someone beam somewhere in Star Trek, a version of them dies. Like, it's more like the Prestige than it's madness. I will say one of the great pleasures of this report is, on the one hand, them detailing some of the rationale in a compared to what we were used to in the past, like unusually explicit way, explaining why certain decisions were made in certain ways, but also like the summaries of what is contained in the things are so funny sometimes. We'll come back to the sort of spicier ones. They get funnier the further up the age rankings you get. But one that stood out for me was, among the other theatrical releases submitted to us each year are numerous film stage productions, enabling audiences across the country and the globe to experience these live performances. Some releases, such as ballet productions, Royal Opera House's The Nutcracker and Bolshoi Ballet Swan Lake, contain no material likely to offend or harm, and so present us no classification issues at U. However, Matthew Bourne's Nutcracker, submitted in 2022, presented an unusual issue in the form of very mild sex references. At U, our guidelines state only very mild sexual behaviour, for example kissing, and references to such behaviour are permitted. The choreography in Bourne's production featured moments of very mild bawdiness, such as hip thrusting and mimed spanking, while fantastical characters made of sugary sweets are seen licking each other in a flirtatious manner. Given the clear theatrical setting and discretion in the choreography's meaning, these moments do not exceed our standards at U, and we classified the film productions as such. But I just love the censor having to like describe what they saw,
and having to think quite carefully. It's like, so this particular sugary sweet licking incident, is it like too sexy?
How horny did that sugar plum make me? Beautiful.
How suggestive is this hip thrusting in a ballet context? Is it normal hip thrusting, or is it, a bit of a grind?
So yeah, someone had fun, I think, putting these reports together.
But one of the things, I suppose, that links the IFCO and the BBFC reports, I mean, the BBFC one is much more comprehensive, but one of the things that really links them is the complaints section. Like, shout out to the 6 people who wrote into the BBFC about Minions, The Rise of Gru, being too violent. 6 of you out there, wonderful people. Minions.
Look.
Yeah.
There's a very specific joy that arises in my heart from like people who are that earnestly committed to a completely sort of futile cause.
I love that people are writing in. I just like, it's a bit so low tech, the idea that you would sit down and compose either an email or a letter. There was one very funny one in the BBFC where it said that they were talking about classifying the Batman, and that a child wrote in and said, but I'll be under the age for the classification and I won't be able to see it, and I want to see it.
That crops up about 3 times. It's quite a significant bit of this report is given over to discussing the decisions around Matt Reeves, the Batman. It's the one, the Robert Pattinson one from the most recent sort of iteration. But yeah, there's several bits of discussion where they're kind of like, look, we recognise that kids love the Batman, and then it's sad that they don't get to see the Batman, but this version of the Batman is really fucked up. It was really dark shit. Like the Riddler's basically just like an incel who like assembles a group of fellow incels to perpetrate an active shooter incident in like a very in a public place. Like it's bad. It's not good stuff.
Yeah, they're quite explicit. Like compared to previous versions of the franchise, this is not for children. Sorry.
Unlike admittedly, with a longue durée perspective on the Batman franchise, also just very funny because obviously Tim Burton's Batman was sort of bad enough. Tim Burton's Batman Returns, where the Penguin is just an open and explicit sex criminal, constantly talking about the unspeakable things he wants to do to Catwoman, who is, in full dominatrix attire. It's, that like, how that film was let anywhere near children is a miracle. But, exerted exerted no influence that could ever be discernible in me, certainly, say.
No, never.
No.
No interest in leather at all. But the IFCO have recently started publishing in detail the complaints that they receive. So rather than just saying, someone wrote to us and in kind of a vague way, they produced a table recently. And it's a joy, I have to say. I really enjoyed this table. People, for some reason, were very exercised about a man called Otto. Which
I think that some of these are interesting for, obviously some of them are ridiculous in ways that we'll poke fun at. I think so, some do reflect sort of changing sensibilities and sensitivities. Like I think that with the man called Otto, it seems to be the depiction of an attempted suicide, and I think that's possibly people being like, I would have liked to have known going into this that's in there because it's triggering. And I think there was discussion in the BBFC report of like they've shifted the way they handle domestic violence for quite similar reasons. So some of it I'm kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is sort of salutary or like might be worth listening to. Some of it, not so much.
I mean, yeah, the complaints about the Banshees of Inisherin, that film that, to be honest, there was a huge outpouring of love and affection from most people in Ireland. Like, a lot of people said, yeah, right on, we love Barry Keoghan, we love the whole thing, it's great. But yeah, people wrote in to the eye complaining that, what did it do again? Oh, yes. So the one complaint was suicide, accents, and portrayals of Irish people.
Which is quite a blend.
I want to know what the accents problem was. Like, too Irish, not Irish enough, not appropriate.
I think it's pretty much, in terms of all the major roles, it's an all-Irish cast, right?
Yeah, it's an all-Irish cast, yeah. I mean, the accents are, if you want to be, like, totally nitpicky, they don't represent the way people would have spoken English in the 1920s on the island of Arran. But,
yeah,
like, okay, so they're not historically accurate, but they're contemporary Irish accents spoken by contemporary Irish people who happen to be playing people from 100 years ago.
Like, I will say, yeah, because it was something that I was sort of struck by on, Irish Studies Twitter when that film came out, was, that there is a not insubstantial or, like, kind of vocal portion of Irish academics who do hate Martin McDonagh, like, and his whole sort of approach. But it's very transparent that in the same way that everything else is being kind of remixed in these films in the postmodern way, like, stage Irishness is another component of that postmodern citational gumbo, So it's not like he's ignorant of it. But yeah, there's something about, the kind of like Tarantinification of Irishness that really rubs up particularly older, particularly female Irish academics in quite a significant way.
Like, the thing is, there are things that I could say that I don't like about the Banshees of Inisherin, but the stage Irishness and the idea that stage Irishness is completely foreign to Irish people themselves, producing it for ourselves and for our own entertainment, I really disagree with, because it is part of who we are. And yes, other people do it to us, but we also do it for ourselves. But it is part of who we are. And just because you don't like it doesn't mean that it is an illegitimate statement of Irishness. Plenty of people in this country love it. They do it on local radio. They do it on the national broadcaster. We do it in the pub. We do it on Twitter. You know, it is who we are. It's part of how we take the piss out of ourselves and part of how we reinforce elements of Irishness. So I don't have a problem with it for that reason. And if you think it's like, if you don't like it, that's fine. It's a bit like Angela's Ashes. People didn't like that because they thought it was twee and fake or whatever. And then they said it wasn't historically accurate, which is nonsense. I mean, memoirs, they're not supposed to be historically accurate. That's not the point. But people did really like that book and they really connected with it because they are okay with that sort of element, I think. But anyway, that's my soapbox on Irishness.
In a way that's hard to maybe systematize. Like there's a huge difference between, the kind of knowing sort of tongue-in-cheek stage Irishry of that film, say, versus, SNL, like, doing its sort of Oscars sketch where they cut to, Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson going, like, being completely incomprehensible and, like, drunk. And it's like, these are two of the most eloquent and thoughtful people on the red carpet at any given moment. Like, what is this? I mean, speaking of historical accuracy, that was another complaint leveled at Banshees, which, again, I'm like, in like, what... In terms of its handling, like, I'm assuming that's about, like, the handling of the Civil War or something. But it's like... And, like, an allegory and a kind of it's so obviously, like, a fairy tale, right? The whole kind of, like, this absurd proposition of the finger cutting and, like...
Like, I could get all steamed up about the fact that it's historically inaccurate that they're all speaking English because they're on Arran. So no one should actually be speaking English to them among themselves, but they are. So... Like, it's not a historical representation of Arran or even of Ireland in the 20s. It's interesting that people feel that the censor will somehow adjudicate, the classifier at this point is the classification office, that the classification office will somehow possibly still be a censor and just delete the bits or cut parts or something.
It's a dance as old as time, right? I mean, obviously, McDonagh deliberately positions himself in a sort of tradition that stretches back to Sing and, courts similar controversies or restages them in kind of deconstructive ways and whatever. But, like, that sense of, like, no, that's not the Western life. Like the way that this is somehow a kind of, the same impulse that once bred objections to, like, the Playboy and things, that they're still being resurfaced as, like, no, you can't be depicting us this way, as if that's a category that falls within the remit. Like, what everyone makes of the remit of the censor. Like, I think, at least a concession that, like, that's not, upholding the sort of good name of the nation isn't one of the things that's meant to be, not even in the sense of, like, this is seditious, but just in the sense of, like, it makes us look like twats.
Yeah, I mean, it is not the job of filmmakers to make us look good to the rest of the world.
It's also some very funny pulling in different directions sort of complaints. So on the one hand, we're told we have a complainant stating that the rating for Saltburn was too lenient. Can't have fellas drinking other fellas' cummy bathwater and humping graves on wide release. But also... quite a few people who I really hope, like, knew each other or were, like, involved somehow, complaining that the rating for Cocaine Bear was too strict. Some kids somewhere really wanting to see Cocaine Bear.
Certainly a lot of these sorts of letter-writing campaigns, they can often be coordinated when there's large numbers, through the internet or through various associations or groups. And that's a long and sometimes inglorious tradition.
I'll also say when we say large numbers, we mean like 3. Like these are scant complaints.
These are scant, yes. But yeah, it's interesting that there is that dialogue still going on between the public and the classification offices. And sometimes it's through those structured consultation processes where they get people in and they make them take surveys and they have quite long and involved discussions. And that seemed to be something that both in Britain and Ireland, younger people who are watching film aren't as interested in classification by age as a concept, but are more interested in, can you just give me a content warning on or a trigger warning? And that's a really interesting shift in how people are perceiving the job of the content moderator that is the classifier. It's like, tell me, will there be suicide in it? I'd like to know.
It seems so much closer to like what this whole process could or should have been, from the beginning, is just provide people with a sort of accurate summary of those aspects of something that may trouble their sensibilities or, negatively affect their well-being, and then make an informed decision. I find it kind of infuriating that the people who will sort of claim that like, media shouldn't come with content warnings because it's inherently censorious. And it's like, no, like merely descriptive summary. Like, books come with blurbs. Like films have trailers. Like we tell people roughly what to expect in something to calibrate their expectation as well as to, appeal to them commercially. And it doesn't seem to me, invidious to sort of, to allow an audience to make some kind of informed decision about what it kind of confronts itself with.
I don't know about you, but when I see those, like on the video on demand, and it says, sexual assault, drug use, sex, whatever, and I just go, oh yeah. And then it literally, like, it just gets wiped from my mind. And I do not actually expect any sex when the thing starts, because often what they mean by sex is so nebulous that I'm like, it's not porn sex. It's just someone lying in bed with someone else. And,
it's the back to, Paul and Pressburger, the sex atmosphere or whatever it was. to get into little funny linguistic sort of turns, the BBFC report consistently talks about feeling that something could be contained by a 15 rating or contained by an 18 rating. And I think that's really the underlying kind of language structures and how that almost like metaphorizes what they see themselves as doing. I find very interesting.
And it relates back to contagion again, doesn't it? Containing the infection. There's echoes of the older language within that. And,
and obviously it is like night and day. Like it's very much an organization that is performing its enthusiasm for cinema. There's a slightly tongue-in-cheek quality to how some of this report's written. Like they talk about the sort of 18 rating that they gave to Benedetta, which is Paul Verhoeven's latest film, which is, among many other things, like sort of lesbian nun drama. And it's, but they're kind of like, Benedetta is a French drama from Dutch director Paul Verhoeven, whose filmography is no stranger to the 18 certification.
We've seen him before and we know what to expect.
Yeah. We've seen RoboCop, Basic Instinct, Showgirls. It's actually, it's like, yeah, okay.
The reports ended up being surprisingly interesting and entertaining, and they are online for anyone who wants to read them as well. Like, we didn't have to go to an archive. This was relatively easy in the context of research.
Yeah, and they're sort of advertising like a forthcoming sort of consultation. The BBFC, I think every 5 years or so do a sort of consultation process where they canvass opinion from I think about 10,000 people. They keep saying so. The commitment to transparency is sincere, but yeah, really interesting opportunity to kind of see inside the mind of not the censor anymore, but, the kind of certificating body, but also to kind of see them trying to, like, continue their relevance in a 21st century sort of media landscape.
I would love to be part of that, people feeding in their opinions on what classification means. Unfortunately, there's no application form that I could find.
I was going to say, BBFC, we're right here. You know, tap us in.
Yeah, IFCO, please, please. I'm in Ireland. I'll do it.